November 1942, somewhere in the foggy streets of Copenhagen, a German officer is walking alone, probably thinking about his next meal or maybe a letter from home. He never hears it coming. No crack of gunfire, no warning, nothing. 1 second he's breathing, the next second he's on the cold cobblestones, and whoever killed him is already 3 streets over, weapon hidden inside a coat like it was never even there. The gun that ended his life looked absolutely ridiculous, like someone grabbed a rusty piece of pipe from a basement and called it a weapon. There was no shiny trigger guard, no beautiful curves, no polished metal gleaming in the moonlight. Honestly, by every normal standard, this thing was the ugliest firearm the British ever handed to their soldiers. But here's the twist, it was also the most lethal silent weapon of the entire Second World War. They called it the Welrod pistol, and it wasn't built to charge into battle or win firefights in open fields. No, this weapon had one job: to fight a completely different kind of war. A war in the shadows, in occupied cities, in that terrifying space between a resistance fighter's hidden hand and a traitor's unsuspecting head. And it did that job so well that people died before anyone even knew a gun had been fired. Think about how insane that is. Now let me take you back to 1941, because the British had a serious problem on their hands. Winston Churchill had just created this organization called the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, and he gave them one simple order: set Europe ablaze. Sounds dramatic, right? But he meant it. British agents were being dropped into Nazi-occupied France, Denmark, Norway, all over the continent really. Resistance networks were forming, sabotage missions were being planned, bridges were getting blown up, supply lines were being cut. But there was this one massive gap in their toolkit. When an SOE agent needed to quietly eliminate someone, maybe a Nazi officer or a collaborator who'd been selling out resistance fighters, their options were straight out of the Middle Ages. You had knives, but that meant getting close enough to touch someone, which is incredibly dangerous. You had garrotes, those wire strangulation tools, but those required serious strength and the perfect position. Poison was an option too, but it was unpredictable and way too slow. What these agents desperately needed was a gun that could kill someone at close range without alerting every single German soldier within a quarter-mile radius. The problem was that silenced weapons back then were pretty much useless for actual silent killing. The suppressed Sten gun, which was one of the British favorites, still made about 130 decibels of noise. To put that in perspective, that's as loud as a jackhammer tearing up concrete. Sure, it masked the distinctive crack of a gunshot, but it was absolutely not silent. Standard pistol suppressors from that era got you down to maybe 120 decibels, which sounds quieter on paper, but in reality it was still loud enough that anyone across the street or through a wall could hear it clearly. If you were within 50 meters, you knew someone was shooting. So the SOE needed something that had genuinely never existed before, a weapon so quiet you could fire it inside a crowded building and people wouldn't even look up. A weapon so simple that it physically couldn't jam or malfunction when your life depended on it. A weapon so small and compact it could vanish into your coat pocket. It seemed completely impossible. The job landed on the desks of a small team working at this place called the Inter-Services Research Bureau, specifically Station 9, tucked away in Welwyn Garden City just north of London. The main guy in charge was Major Hugh Reeves, and he had a small group of engineers working with him whose names, sadly, got buried under layers of wartime classification and probably still are today. But here's what made them different. They didn't approach this like traditional gunsmiths trying to build a better pistol. They treated it like an acoustic engineering problem, like they were trying to soundproof a recording studio instead of building a weapon. And that shift in thinking changed everything. Let's talk about what actually makes a gunshot loud, because it's not just one thing. First, you've got the explosion of gases escaping from the barrel when the bullet leaves. That's the main bang you hear. Second, you've got the supersonic crack of the bullet itself breaking the sound barrier as it flies through the air. Third, you've got all the mechanical noise from the gun cycling, the slide moving back, the empty shell casing ejecting, the next round loading. To get true silence, you had to eliminate all three of those sound sources. The Welrod team started with the bullet itself, which was smart. Standard 9mm ammunition, the kind used in most pistols, travels at around 350 meters per second. The speed of sound is about 343 meters per second at sea level, so that bullet is going supersonic, and every single shot creates this sharp cracking sound in the air. No matter how well you suppress the gases from the gun, that sonic boom is still going to give you away. Their solution was brilliantly simple: use regular 9mm bullets, but reduce the amount of gunpowder in each round. That brought the speed down to around 290 meters per second, just under the speed of sound. Subsonic, silent in flight, problem solved. Next was the mechanical noise, and this is where they made a really bold choice. Semi-automatic pistols, the kind where you pull the trigger and the gun automatically ejects the empty casing and loads the next round, make a ton of noise doing all that. The slide slamming back and forth, metal hitting metal, it's loud. So the Welrod team just threw that whole concept out the window. They made it bolt action instead, like a hunting rifle. After every shot, you had to manually twist this knurled knob at the back of the gun to pull out the empty casing and load the next bullet. Was it slower? Absolutely. But it was virtually silent, and when you're standing 2 feet from a Nazi officer in a quiet hallway, speed isn't as important as not getting caught. The third challenge was the big one, those explosive gases. When a bullet leaves the barrel, all that expanding gas behind it creates what's basically a miniature explosion right at the end of the gun. That's your classic gunshot sound, the bang everyone recognizes. The Welrod solution to this was revolutionary in how simple and effective it was. The suppressor wasn't some attachment you screwed onto the end of the barrel. The suppressor was the gun. The entire front section of the Welrod, roughly 2/3 of its total length, was just a series of baffles and expansion chambers built right into the weapon. When you fired, those propellant gases would enter this maze of chambers and expand gradually, cooling down and slowing as they moved through, until they finally vented out into the air so gently it barely made a sound. The results were absolutely extraordinary. A normal 9mm pistol produces about 160 decibels at the muzzle, which is loud enough to cause instant permanent hearing damage if you're not wearing protection. The Welrod produced roughly 73 decibels. That's about as loud as closing a car door. If you were standing 10 meters away, the sound dropped even further and became almost impossible to distinguish from normal city background noise. Car passing, someone shutting a window, that kind of thing. The weapon itself was only about 14 inches long total. The grip was just a simple metal cylinder wrapped in rubber so your hand wouldn't slip, and hidden inside that grip was a magazine holding 6 rounds. Later versions bumped that up to 8. The barrel stuck out from the front and honestly looked like a piece of plumbing pipe you'd find in a hardware store. There was no trigger guard, just this small curved trigger sticking out from the bottom. The sights were super basic, just a fixed front blade and a rear notch, because the Welrod was never designed for shooting targets far away. Its effective range was about 23 meters, but realistically, you wanted to be much closer than that. This was a contact weapon, meant to be pressed right against someone's body or fired from across a small room. At those distances, perfect accuracy didn't really matter. What mattered, the only thing that mattered, was absolute silence. And in that regard, the Welrod succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Production started in late 1942, And here's something interesting, the exact number of well rods manufactured is still classified today, even after all these decades. Estimates range anywhere from 2,800 units to 14,000 units, which is a huge gap. That variance tells you just how secretive this whole program was. They deliberately scattered the serial numbers to confuse anyone trying to count how many were made. They kept almost no documentation, and what little paperwork existed was mostly destroyed after the war. The first time the well rods saw real action was in early 1943. SOE agents started receiving them through secret supply drops all across occupied Europe, and the weapon earned immediate respect from the resistance fighters who used it. In France, the Maquis, those rural resistance guerrillas, used well rods for what they coldly called executive actions. German officers who'd been especially cruel to French civilians had a habit of dying very quietly. Collaborators who'd betrayed resistance networks to the Gestapo stopped talking permanently. The well rod made assassinations possible in situations that would have been suicide with any other gun. There's one documented story about a target being eliminated in a crowded Paris cafe, right in the middle of the afternoon. The killer calmly walked out through a room packed with people. And not a single person realized what had just happened until someone noticed the body slumped in the corner. In Denmark, the resistance group called Holger Dansk used well rods constantly. Their targets included Danish Nazis, Gestapo informants, German intelligence officers, all the people making life hell for ordinary Danes. The silence of the weapon meant they could operate in broad daylight, in busy urban areas, in circumstances that would have meant certain death with a louder firearm. In Norway, SOE agents deployed well rods during sabotage operations. You could take out a guard without alerting the patrol just around the corner. Those few precious seconds of confusion after a silent kill often made the difference between successfully blowing up a railway bridge and getting captured and executed. But beyond the tactical advantages, there was this huge psychological impact on the German occupation forces. Officers started to realize that being in a quiet room didn't mean they were safe. The absence of gunfire didn't mean the absence of danger. Informants became much harder for the Germans to recruit because potential collaborators understood that betraying the resistance might mean death without any warning, without any sound, without any chance to cry out for help. That fear, that uncertainty, it was almost as valuable as the weapon itself. Now let's compare this to what the Germans and Americans were working on at the same time, because context matters. German suppressed weapons were mostly just regular service pistols with attachments added. The Walther PPK could be fitted with a screw-on suppressor that got the noise down to about 115 decibels, which was quieter than normal but still clearly recognizable as a gunshot. More importantly, German suppressor technology was designed for different purposes, mainly reducing muzzle flash and sound signature for snipers, not enabling close-range assassinations in crowds. The Americans built something called the HDM, the High Standard Model D, which was a suppressed .22 caliber pistol used by the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which was basically America's version of the SOE. This weapon was genuinely quiet, achieving around 90 decibels, but the .22 caliber round was just too weak. You often needed multiple shots to make sure someone was actually dead, and the tiny bullet had trouble penetrating heavy winter coats, which was a real problem in European winters. The Wellrod's 9mm round, even with its reduced powder charge, delivered way more stopping power. One shot was usually enough. When you look at the specifications side by side, the story becomes crystal clear. The Wellrod achieved 73 decibels with a serious 9mm round. The American HDM hit 90 decibels with a weak .22 caliber. German suppressed pistols rarely got below 115 decibels. In the cold, brutal arithmetic of silent killing, The well rod was in a category completely by itself. Nothing else came close. Of course, there was one significant limitation worth mentioning. The well rod's integrated suppressor didn't last forever. Inside the baffle stack were these rubber wipes that sealed around each bullet as it passed through, and those rubber pieces degraded over time with repeated firing.